Hey, my guest today is somebody a friend described to me as, quote, really involved in the YC cinematic universe. A previous company of his called Mixpanel was very foundational for product led growth. But today, Suhail Doshi has his sights set on building an AI powered graphics editor. Playground AI is a product that wants to be more than just a model that generates images from text, but allows you to create in a much more fine grained and intentional way. You'll hear from Suhail about his work on Playground, how he understands the artistic community it affects, and his perspectives on what's important and undervalued in the AI community right now. This is the Gradient Podcast. I'm Daniel Bashir. The best way you can help me out with this project is by sharing it with people you know and by leaving ratings and feedback. And before we begin, this episode is sponsored by the world's first AI Quality Conference. Colina and the MLOps community have teamed up to host this event in San Francisco on June 25th about rigorous, reliable, and scalable AI. You'll hear about Cruise's recent AI efforts, as well as from speakers coming from Anthropic, Notion, OpenAI, and many other places. You can use the discount code Hallucinate to get 30% off their ticket price. And now, without further ado, Suhail Doshi. So, Suhail, I was thinking about different places to kind of start this conversation, and it occurred to me that a non-trivial part of my preparation, because by my standards you're a very prolific tweeter, was going through your tweets. And one that I came across recently was where you said you were going all in on 50% AI generated music. And I sent this to a friend of mine, and he was like, I think this guy is stuck in pivot hell. And then we saw one of your replies, and you were like, no, this is like Playground is going to be a great company. This music thing is kind of bad business, good personal creative hobby. But that kind of made me think a little bit about the different things that you're just generally paying attention to. You're, building your business focused on generation and computer vision, but then you also are kind of interested in music. So you think that like this is going to be kind of a thing. And I was curious about that a little bit.
Right. Yeah. I realized that some people took that as like, I'm now going to go start a company in music or something.
All in sounds a little bit like, yeah.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I realized that after. Sometimes you don't realize how other people will take things. No, I'm very invested and excited about what we're doing at Playground and working on graphics and things like that as a business. No, I've been making music for, 6, 7 years as a hobby. Kind of just started out with like, I knew nothing, didn't know how to play a musical instrument, didn't know what the notes were, what, A through, G, didn't know anything like that, and so, one of the problems I face as like a producer is that because I produce music is, I don't have access to like vocalists. And so, I guess I just meant it as a hobby, but I take our hobbies very seriously. So I don't know, all in for me on that was like, for me is like a bigger deal, but yeah, I'm not pivoting, but I'm really excited about being able to use AI to create lyrics. I can't rap or I can't sing, but I definitely can write. I can definitely make lyrics or work with GPT-4 to make lyrics and curate and stitch things together to get cool lyrics like rap. Rap is super fun for me, so it was really fun to make like a couple songs.
I see the keyboard in your background, and also I think one of the things you posted, you were like, I basically did all the instrumentation, everything but the lyrics. I'm kind of curious. I've spoken with at least one other person who is thinking about AI-enabled music generation, a guy named Now Tokui, who does some really interesting stuff around this. And he had a lot of ideas around that intersection of AI and then music as like a creative act. And I'm curious, as somebody who has been getting into music for quite a while now, if that has driven your thoughts on this intersection, and if that maybe if you think about it differently when you're doing music as opposed to working on something like Playground, perhaps.
They're actually really similar to me. It just turns out that the music industry is like just not a very big market, so I'm keeping it as a hobby. The music industry, unfortunately, is like a $26 billion market total, right? That's like one tech company. um, and but anyway, they're both really related to creative expression, right? Like the reason why we started Playground was because um, I was really excited about what creative things that people could make using these tools, using the technology. It was the first time ever where I just genuinely felt like I didn't have those skills to create something, create a graphic, create an illustration, and if I could take like where this thing is at its end state, at some point I'll be able to completely control it without having any skill. Music is a great example of that for me, which preceded my interest in graphics with Playground because um, I actually can't play a musical instrument. Like I can kind of play this piano, I've taken lessons or whatever, but I'm not a pianist. I don't really know how to play any physical instrument, but I definitely know how to, but I can somehow still make music with my computer. I can use a piece of software called Ableton, and I can completely write chords and melodies, and I can like layer sounds. I have a symphony in my computer. And I think that's just the most amazing thing. Like I don't need to have a symphony behind me. I can have a symphony in front of me with my computer, and I can make anything I want. I don't need to learn how to play the trumpet. I can use my computer to play the trumpet, but of course I come up with like all the chords and the melodies and the stabs and like everything like that. And it seems like computers have been an amazing tool for creative expression. Hip hop started with drum machines, right? Drum machines were $600 devices that early hip hop producers used, and they used them because they were cheap and they would sample sounds. They would like take a record and they would like, it's kind of funny. It's like all this stuff is coming back, right? They would take a record, they would sample it. It's almost like scraping. And then they would take the audio and they would stretch it and pitch it and cut it up, and they would save it in memory, and then they would like rap over it or whatever, right? Or they make a beat, and you could only have so many tracks, right? Like a context window almost. And so you'd be limited by what you could do, and then you'd put out a song and that'd be a record. And it's not like any of these producers, a lot of them didn't know how to play instruments, but it was cheap. And because it was cheap, it was accessible, and it allowed that scene to arise in the world. And I think that's so amazing because there are tons of people for whom either can't afford to have lessons, to learn how to draw, whatever, or they don't have time, but they definitely have creative expression. And art is like a truly human thing, I think, that humans have made, right? Like animals don't really appreciate art, right? My dog, like he sees a picture on the wall, he doesn't know what that is, right? It's like a very human thing. It's really hard to define art. And so I just sort of think that these things that are happening with AI are just like making it more accessible for more people to make new things. And so I was hoping with my tweet to show people in the world that actually it's human and machine still. Like I still really enjoy doing the instrumentation, even though the AI is helping me do like rap.
I like the way you put it, and you're making me think of something I read last year that made this kind of similar point about this almost orthogonality. There's this thing that Tolstoy wrote very late in his life. It's a short book called What is Art? And in it, it's interesting because there are ways in which it's a really extreme view, and I think this is actually a really good example of taking a a point of view, a definition, and then exploring it as far as it will go into its ramifications. And he kind of defines art as, in its most basic sense, just stuff that makes you feel something. It has this kind of emotive force. And insofar as you think art is something like, I am able to produce something, doesn't matter exactly what it is, that has this emotive force, then he starts to view skill and the power of art as these kind of separate things. And actually, this kind of leads him to write a lot about how he thinks art schools are a really bad thing and how people should not be making money off of art because that kind of resists, like, allowing people to create the kind of art that they should be creating in his view. But it felt kind of similar to what you were saying, his point about art and then the skill required to create art being these two separate things. I do think there's important overlap in certain domains. I'm curious if that kind of feels right to you based off of what you're saying.
Yeah. Um, it's funny because in music, there's like the people that want to make music and they want to have this kind of creative expression about the music that they make, and they're sort of like, I don't care whether the audience wants it or not. It's a Rick Rubin style version of music. And then there's this thing called the music business, right? It's like, do you want to make music or do you want to be in the music business? And those are completely different things. Sometimes they overlap, right? Sometimes you make music, someone makes a song and people love it and it's great. But there are also artists who do this like kind of avant-garde music and it doesn't take off, right? And that's because there's a music business. That's like pop and top, rappers and that kind of thing. And I think that, I love the definition that art is how you make humans feel, basically, or how you make someone feel. But there are no rules whether you should make money with art or not. Like, we're just making that up as a human species. Um, and so I think, that's in part why I think, like, I think it's like maybe somewhat, I find that it's going to be hard for humans are going to have a hard time connecting with art. People already have this bias. As soon as they see the word AI made this thing, all the art is like lost. It's like, oh, this thing is devoid of emotion. But if you just never told them that, right, they would never know and they would feel something. And so it's funny. I sent a few friends like a few songs that I had made with the AI, and they had no idea that it was made with AI. And they were just like amazed. They were like, wow, how did you get like the rapper on this? And then I posted it on Twitter and I'm like, this was rapped by AI. And they're like, this sucks. There's this very interesting like human bias, but interestingly, I'm noticing between couple, like about even 18 months ago, I had this like tweet that got me canceled. It was like, I said, AI art is art. And it like went super viral. It went on Reddit, like Twitter, everywhere, got like 20 million views or something. Basically just people like getting very angry about it. And I thought actually tweeting about the music thing would like elicit the same, or some, not exactly the same response, but some proportionate response. And I was surprised to see actually that literally no one cared. They didn't care that like there was like an AI thing behind it. They were cool. They were happy that I made this song. There were some people in the industry are happy that they were like, wow, that's cool. You can make it with AI. But the reaction actually wasn't very negative. And I look at the arc of that and I'm like, it's like people are getting normalized to it, right? It's for a long time, people were not, they were very opposed with people making sampling. Sampling was a big problem in music. And then now most of the songs we listen to, you listen to any Kanye song, it's pretty much like sampled from something. No one cares. Nobody cares that the top 100 songs on Spotify are made on a computer. That the person that made it, Avicii songs were not made with an actual piano. They were sampled from a piano, right? Nobody cares. And so I think this like normalcy with art and creative expression is just like continuing now, and it's just AI, and people are just going to get used to it. And there's this great saying in music that I think you could probably extrapolate to even images and graphics, which is, if it sounds good, it is good. I love that, right? And I think you could extrapolate that. You could be like, if it looks good, it is good, right? And there's a human behind it.
Yeah, I'm thinking a lot about the it looks good, it is good, but then also the different things we kind of look for when it comes to the art we consume, because there's the pure aesthetic quality of this is just a track that sounds really good and I can kind of enjoy it, but also people look to things for, I guess, storytelling or ways to kind of understand the world around them. I mean, people will listen to Taylor Swift songs and wonder who that was about, and we have this like intrinsic desire to kind of know about sometimes the stories, the people behind the work we're consuming. And it seems very hard. You did say, of course, that we're getting normalized to good, aesthetically, valuable, interesting art can be created by AI systems, by computers, and we can enjoy it. But I'm wondering if that's still like slightly different from whatever it is we're seeking when we listen to something that's a little bit more story like in nature, and then we kind of seek what is the real life story or something else underpinning that.
Yeah, like I made a song um basically for Gary Tan who like coined this phrase like just 2 weeks ago. It's called boom loop. It's this idea that like San Francisco's kind of coming back, and instead of being in a doom loop, we're like in a boom loop because of technological progress, and just progress of the city doesn't actually have anything to do with technology necessarily. And so I made a song that like where I re-rapped using the word boom loop and tried to make it catchy and like gave it a hook. So I think there's still a story behind that, right? Even though I didn't rap it, I conceived it. It came up with something that was actually very human. The progress of our city. And I think the same is not, there's nothing really different about graphics. What we're doing with Playground, where we try to help people like make these amazing images and do amazing feats with graphics. There's going to be somebody out there. My son like suddenly has turned from caring about cars to rockets, right? I don't know. And someone out there is going to like make a book. They might want to make a book about space, but maybe they're bad at illustrating, just like I'm bad at rapping. I just don't have that skill, right? But that doesn't mean someone can't tell that story or tell a story that my son loves, that really resonates with him. And those are choices that are made by humans. And so I just really believe that people are a little too like AI and what's human. And it's actually just like the intersection of these two disciplines, that people are going to be behind it, but they're just utilizing them like a tool. And I'm actually honestly astonished that that seems like an odd concept because we've been experiencing with computers for 30 years.
The point of that is an odd concept. I do wonder if it's the kind of auguring of something just totally different or more of the impulse coming from an AI system or something. But I do want to talk a little bit about, in the context of Playground, the idea of what you're doing as a sort of a creative suite and allowing people to achieve something like an artistic impulse or something they kind of want to put out into the world, and how you think about enabling that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different varying levels of utility, but the truth is, and I think this is something that sometimes is hard for people to understand, sometimes easy, is that creative expression is like a very high utility thing for humanity, right? Like the early one of the coolest forms of it actually was that unfortunately didn't like completely work out, but it was like MySpace. And if anyone is old enough to remember MySpace and use MySpace or had a MySpace, MySpace was like basically Facebook. But the cool thing about it was that doesn't exist anymore today, is they completely let you change like the UI. You could like write CSS, and you could have, if you wanted cats just like running around the screen, you could do that. You wanted to put like patterns or like weird fonts, you could do that. It was actually like, I feel like MySpace was this wonderful thing that showed you how much people cared about creative expression. So that's like one end of utility for graphics. And then of course there's like this higher end utility. That's just even the nature of vision, which we care actually quite a bit about at Playground, which is like, of course you could make like I mean, graphics are just like a subset of overall vision. And so vision has like super high utility, everything from like, bounding boxes on surveillance cameras to like helping a robot like navigate some like complex space, right? And then there's kind of stuff in the middle, which is like, how do you help people do like editing, right? There's like huge apps on the app store right now, and the only thing they do is like remove a background so that you can like take an e-commerce item and like put it on your Shopify store, that kind of thing. So that's kind of the range I think of like what we're talking about when I think of it just as pixels. And I think that's like this enormous range. And so there's utility up and down that entire range, I think. um and there's things like t-shirts and books, and then there's I have a wedding photo and I want to color grade differently. I want to get rid of like a weird strand of hair, right? From like the wedding book album. So graphics is like this massive category. I don't know if people realize it, but Adobe has like this single segment called digital media, and it makes $12 billion a year. And these are people that know how to use those complicated tools like Photoshop, Lightroom, Illustrator. I don't know if you're an expert at Photoshop. I'm definitely not. I tried to take tutorials when I was in high school doing logo contests and stuff. It's hard. It takes 10,000 hours to get good.
Thinking a little bit about then graphics and how we begin kind of getting at this. One of the things you've been really working on with Playground is basically trying to build a unified computer vision model. You've released Playground V2, V2.5, and you've been doing some really interesting things with these models. You kind of have the stable diffusion XL as sort of your base. And in 2.5, you also had some really interesting ways that you built on top of it to create more aesthetically pleasing images. But maybe before we get into some of those specific elements of it, talking a little bit at like a high level, I'd love to understand how you think about the quest, I guess, to build this sort of unified model that's able to allow people to edit pixels and all of this.
Yeah. So I think that, at a very 10,000 foot view, I generally feel that like the category of vision just in general is underinvested in. Like there's like 30 LLM companies, probably more at this point. If you go to like the LLM arena or whatever, you can like see all of the models, all the fine tunes, everything that everybody's working on. And everyone's working on one modality, but ultimately like language is inherently low dimensionality, right? It's like humans have conceived words so that we can communicate about things, but but actually like these words are not sufficient to describe the world, right? And a very simple example of this is like we literally don't have words to describe like certain emotions or certain things. Like there's this list that went around the internet. One of my favorite things was like this list that went around the internet, and it was like someone had made up words to describe like human things, human feelings or things. Like an example was like one of my favorite ones was like, you know, when you sit down on a bench and you're just like watching the world go by. We don't have a word for that. You're like wondering like, oh, I'm just like this small thing in the world, and the world's passing by, and everyone has like this unique story. We don't have like a word for that. Maybe other languages do, but or like if you were trying to describe like shattered glass, you and I would have completely different descriptions, even if we were given like a page to write our description of that. So I think that just broadly vision, one of the greatest things about vision is that it's extremely high bandwidth, very information dense. So I think at a very high level, I think that vision just in general is extremely deeply underinvested in, but like very necessary, in my opinion, to make extremely powerful models that are capable of doing things that are well exceed what human capability is capable of. So I think that if we go one step down from that, you know, we tend to think a little bit of like there's lots of subfields within computer vision, and so the area that we're trying to focus on, maybe like all the way at the bottom of that, of like that tree, is graphics, because graphics just tends to be a category that like has a lot of utility for humanity, whether that's creative expression or something else. And so yeah, so we released Playground V 2.5, and it was based on the SDXL architecture. The reason why we did that was because we wanted to prove to ourselves that we could like, we wanted to see how far we could push that architecture with just like cleverness and data and, you know, that kind of thing. We didn't really expect to like beat the state-of-the-art open source model at the time right now as significantly as we did. And so there are definitely plans to like probably shed that architecture and move on to something completely different. It was kind of like a demo of our research team to see how far could we go. And it like let us build out our data sets and everything. But we wanted to strike at one simple thing that users care about, which is just they really deeply care about image quality. And in particular, like users really care about like we care about faces. It just turns out like humans are so good at picking up like the uncanny valley of faces, right? Or just like any image quality things, like hands are like something we always pick up, right? Because we know what hands are supposed to look like. Or even like celebrity faces are a good example of this, because if we can generally figure out like that doesn't look like, you know, Taylor Swift or like whoever, Elon Musk, that kind of thing. So we wanted to see how far we could push that, because we wanted to see where all the bottlenecks are of that architecture, because it would be very insightful. So I think that's kind of like where we're at. And I think the end goal is to create you know, a graphics model that's capable of like thousands of tasks the way that something like GPT-4 or 4.5 or whatever comes out next, Cloud 3, right? There's not really a graphics model that's multitask, right? All we do is we put in a prompt and we get an image, and maybe it aligns, maybe it doesn't. But it's not really capable of like these hundreds or thousands of very cool tasks that that language is capable of.
I want to work our way towards the vision of, I guess to use a Stanford terminology, a foundation model for vision and kind of what that looks like. But to start with maybe something a little bit smaller in V2.5, I kind of want to understand a few things. I guess one, it's kind of interesting. You talked about the different things you were able to fix when it comes to oddities and generating images of humans, for example. I noticed when I was playing around with Playground, you could specify features of the image which you do not want. And so you could specify, I don't want odd limbs or, you know, hands with the wrong number of fingers and things like this. And it did a really good job with that. One thing you brought out too, and you had these kind of three insights when it came to enhancing the aesthetic quality of images with 2.5. And one of them that was interesting to me was the idea of color and contrast. And I think that looking at this at a surface level, you have an image that does better with color or is more accurate. That makes sense. Higher contrast generally seems like a better image. But when it comes to the aspect of, you know, you want people to realize whatever their vision is for an image by the time they figured that out, I'm thinking now about people sometimes might want more muted colorscapes, less contrast, things like this. And I guess when you're thinking about like a full-on graphics editor, you can see the different ways in which people might want to scale down an attribute or up an attribute like that. And so I guess I'm thinking a little bit about like enabling higher contrast makes a lot of sense, but I'm curious how you think around certain dimensions like this and how that factors into the we want to maybe beat something like STLXL on a benchmark that we've constructed or somebody else has constructed for aesthetic quality or in human preference trials or things like this, but then also the kind of full scale of what people might want out of that.
Right. Yeah. Is your question kind of like around benchmarks and like how we think about benchmarking, or is there a question about how we think about what to work, what to focus on to improve?
I think it's a little bit of both. I guess I'm wondering maybe when it comes to this specific case of the contrast as like an example, how you think about how much the benchmarks are able to tell you about what people really want out of what it is you're trying to build.
Definitely. Yeah. So what we noticed was we collect all kinds of data at Playground, and what we've noticed is that users really love the vibrancy of colors. And the other thing that we noticed was that a lot of these models have kind of like this average brightness. They're almost too bright. And and then the kind of like the third thing that we noticed is something actually that's just like simple. It's kind of like prodding at like the model in like a very simple way. So one thing we noticed is like sometimes it's hard to get these models to just like produce a black background, like just a simple task. So you ask yourself why? Why is it hard to produce a black background? Why is it hard to get the model to align itself to being able to do this? And so there's a technique called offset noise that some people used a while back, and then there's been some other new techniques as well. There's like a zero terminal SNR. It's another technique. We use a technique called EDM, and but the goal is the end goal is the same, which is like, why can't we get this like rich color and contrast? Because we also observe that users really care about that. They really love that. So I think one thing that maybe makes our company a little different than like a standard research team, either in academia or at a research lab, is that we have actual customers we must serve. And these customers tell us what they don't like. And one thing that we noticed with our V2 model in December was one thing they said was that the model was too bright. And we're like, oh man, it really is. This really is too bright. This is bad. So let's fix that. And so I think in terms of, how do we pick things? That one way that's very easy is we just listen to users. That's a very standard, simple way of doing it. Another thing is like, of course, there's a practical thing where we want to obviously show something impressive to the research community. So we obviously want to win on some kind of benchmark, not so insofar as that we don't do something that users care about. But yeah, generally, I think like the evals for these things are pretty fragile. They're pretty brittle. They're not really capturing everything. Now the evals are starting to, interestingly, in vision, or in particular in graphics, I should say, maybe more specifically, in language, there's like 15, 20 benchmarks, right? There's like MMLU, and there's like all these math things and whatever, puzzles. But in graphics, there's been like one for a while, which is just like, I guess there's two. There's human preference, and then there's prompt alignment. That's it. That's all of graphics, which is not very impressive. I mean, it shows the level, like the stage that we're at with graphics is like, it's not just low utility, but it's low utility because the models are not sophisticated enough. They certainly can be way better, capable of more tasks, but our benchmarks are super simple. And so now there's like aesthetics, prompt alignment, and now there's like this new benchmark, like text synthesis, because some people have figured out how to do text. So the benchmarks are starting to like sort of increase as utility grows. And we're kind of inventing it right now, where it's like the frontier is here right now. And I think there's going to be even more crazy ones. I think that we're working on something that's going to like greatly increase the utility of these models. And so I'm hoping that hopefully we'll have like another benchmark. And I think we're very happy to release those things so that people can try to figure out like where they stand on that, especially in academia, where we can give back a little bit and help people. But I definitely think the evals are really, really bad, actually. But I think that's okay while things are early.
One of your tweets that I made note of was relevant here, where you said something like benchmarks are not prepared for how powerful these models will become. And I'm curious, when you were writing that, if you were thinking specifically about the graphics domain and the fragility and the fact that the benchmarks aren't that great, or if that was like a more general point.
It was a general point. Yeah. And there's two things that are happening right now. One is that there's like this marketing thing that's happening, which is like there are a bunch of benchmarks, and everybody wants to impress everybody by showing that they're better than the other person. So that's one thing. And you can see this with the release of Gemini Pro and Ultra or whatever from Google, and they're trying to like show that they're better, or Anthropic, what have you. And there is a presumption that, and I think great researchers, great people in the know understand that probably they may not make this assumption. So I don't think everybody's making an assumption, but I think a broad set of people are making the assumption that these benchmarks generalize to like most of the use cases. But that's probably wrong, right? Like these models are much more sophisticated, and there are far more use cases than we can imagine. Like, I wish that GPT-4 were better at writing rap lyrics. But is anyone going to make a benchmark for that? Definitely not, right? That's at the low end, I feel like. And then there's like the high end, which is like, is this model capable of, achieving this extremely complicated task, right? There was like this thing called Devin that got released that I think some people said maybe uses GPT-4 that can like try to like, basically be a software engineer code. But we don't really have like great evals for something like that. That's like maybe at the high end at the moment, just at the moment. And then there's even higher end things like with robotics and what have you. With graphics, it's like, we can't even, wouldn't it be amazing if you could like upload a CSV file and then like produce like a chart or a flow chart or a visualization, but there's no benchmark for that. So it's like these models are actually like, as the models continue to scale in terms of complexity and power and ability, we don't really have benchmarks that are really showcasing that. And some of these things are like not as simple as like, Alice and Bob, Alice did X and Bob did Y. How many apples does Bob have? Like that kind of thing. Those are really, I would say they were very simplistic evals and benchmarks that are not, where I think people are making maybe they have a broad feeling that they're generalizing, and they probably do generalize to some things, but probably not. They may not generalize to things that people care about, and very complex talks that people care about.
Yeah, and when you speak about generality, it's like not every single person cares about every single ability the model has. One thing that I started thinking about as you were just speaking was this researcher, I think he's at Google right now, Nicholas Carlini, uploaded a pretty interesting blog post and also a personal benchmark of his. And he described this explicitly as, this is my personal benchmark, not an academic benchmark or anything like this, for the things that I specifically care about from LLMs. And this included mostly stuff that would be useful for his research. And he was very careful about how he said this. He was like, I'm not going to prompt the model by telling it it's really smart and that I'm going to murder a cat if it doesn't get this right. I just want to do like simple prompts. And I wanted to be able to do things like rewrite this code in C, or write the code again, but make it a little bit faster, perform certain optimizations, stuff that's mostly helpful for his research. And of course, that's the thing he cares about. Why does he care about, I don't know, whether this can answer a question on the LSAT or something? And so it's interesting too, because a lot of the discourse going on is about the idea of more personalized versions of models. And so you start to think about as well the more personalized version of a benchmark, because you do care about the broad basic set of abilities that might be what should be expected of a model or something. But I do feel as you get into a model that is able to generalize to more different specific things or cover more domains, that question starts to look kind of different.
Yeah. I mean, let's think about it, right? What are the two big use cases for language models right now? Doing homework, writing code. Let's think about the benchmarks. What are the benchmarks? Benchmarks are like, doing an LSAT, puzzle problems, understanding knowledge about whatever, biology, math, physics, right? So guess what? Now they're really good at doing homework, right? You basically ask the model to do homework, learn how to do homework, and now they're good at doing homework. And then the models, additionally, right, like a bunch of engineers, researchers got involved in their code, their engineers. That's a field they understand. So it's easier to make a set of benchmarks around that. So we have code. But I wonder how many researchers or engineers are good at like completely different things outside of their domain that they would measure. I mean, it would be hard to measure like how good are these rap lyrics, right? And in graphics, you know what? There's no benchmark for this. It's kind of funny that there's no benchmark for this, but we know that users care about this. Users really care about photorealism. But we measure aesthetic preference or prompt alignment or now text synthesis. But we know photorealism really matters. But you never see that in a technical report. Why is that? It's very odd. Is it because people don't realize photorealism is important, or is it, what is it, right? So I think that's just, I'd say that's at the very low end of these benchmarks, because I think in reality, um, it's going to be harder to do this like more complex task where like there's a human and they're asking a question and then they get an answer back, and then they're kind of like unhappy with like this trajectory that they're on with the AI to try to get to an answer, um, whatever that happens to be. So that's in part why I think these benchmarks are not really doing a good job of really evaluating the models, and sometimes coming up with like perfect quantitative benchmarks are hard for certain things. They require a little bit of like, there's kind of a qualitative aspect to things, and I think that's not a field of interest for the standard researcher is looking at an academic paper and saying, what is state of the art? What was the number there? Do I have an opportunity to beat that? Great, I beat it. That's sufficient, right? And they tend to not go like too far beyond. Once they get a good result, they write the paper, they publish it, everybody's happy, and then the next person comes along and goes, what's the state of the art benchmark? And but if the benchmarks aren't always like the same, right? Like, and a great example in graphics is FID. And people finally come around over the last, I feel like 18 months, 12 months around like, FID, like there's kind of a general consensus now. Okay, FID is not really a perfect metric. It's not a good metric to evaluate this. But about 2 years ago, you cannot find a report where like anything except, roughly FID and maybe clip similarity are still the standards in all of these academic papers that you read. I read like, probably 20 a month, and they're basically all the same still, right? So I think it's complicated, but I think we have a ways to go.
That's really interesting because you're kind of in a position where you do have to care about these more qualitative things. Like within the academic community, there's often this sort of debate that you're speaking about when it comes to we have set up these quantitative benchmarks. We are kind of aware that what we are measuring is a proxy for the real thing that we want, because we have to do things that way, because we want to have numbers and things that we can measure quickly, that we can stack up different models against and do that at sort of a bird's eye view. And then suddenly, more kind of academic papers and things like this come along saying, is this the best benchmark? Is there maybe a better quantitative benchmark? And then somebody else comes along and says, no, wait, hold on a second. Quantitative benchmarks might just be like a really bad paradigm, and we should do these longer user studies and things like this. And this is all happening within the academic sphere, but then kind of in parallel, when you are out there with Playground building a product, you are already, there's no other way to do it. You have to actually engage users and do this kind of longer process of, we're delivering the thing, let's see what people say to us, and then kind of come back and figure out how that works.
Definitely. I think the company, I think I'll make this like mini little secret of mine perhaps open, which is that I think that the companies that can come up with really strong benchmarks for what seem like sometimes even like somewhat insignificant things, right? Like just, how good is the model at, I'm trying to make up something on the fly, but how good is the model at, whatever, okay, like photorealism, or how good is the model at, not like these highly generic things like prompt alignment, like certainly that's valuable. But how good is the model at, I'll give an example. How good is the model at like creating, like really reproducing a celebrity face? Just as a simple example. Like that's something you wouldn't really expect that much in like a research paper, unless it was really geared towards that, right? Like there are like GANs and stuff that try to do things like that. But I think the companies that really zone in on knowing what their users care about and then making the appropriate benchmark for that very narrow thing, and then they're able to build like 20 of these or 100 of these kinds of like seemingly, who knows that anyone would have cared about this, right? The researchers in academia, they don't know that anyone cares. It's hard for them to know. They have to make a guess. But companies like ours who interface with users, we get to know, right? Just through people being upset about the product not being able to do something. And I think the companies that are able to make these benchmarks that are very tuned for these small things are going to end up with really amazing models that have extraordinarily high utility.
I want to maybe use this to circle back into the discussion we were having about developing more powerful models and how you're thinking about this. And as you mentioned, you are with the current playground model still on the SDXL base as the model, but you're thinking about maybe there are architectural improvements we can make and things like this. And I guess it occurs to me that after, I think this was maybe around the time ChatGPT happened, or probably a little bit before, there were some papers out of Microsoft and other places that were proposing vision foundation models. And I think when I read these, it looked like they were just taking a bunch of different vision architectures and kind of like stapling them together. And so they had like an interesting proposal for something that could do a bunch of different vision tasks, your object detection, your, segmentation and so on. But they didn't really seem to go anywhere. And what you're talking about too has to do with we need to develop better benchmarks and other things. But I'm curious how you're thinking about the, in your case, you want to build this sort of foundation model for graphics, how you're thinking about kind of the path ahead, what that's going to require in terms of this interplay between obviously we need better benchmarks, but then also kind of the architectural innovations and how that kind of works together.
Yeah, there's so many interesting papers that have come out in the last, maybe 15 months, right? So I try to read like all the major big papers that tend to come out roughly every month. So I feel relatively well versed, but occasionally I miss things. But I think back in December last, like 2 Decembers ago, we had the paper which was like DIT by William Peebles, I believe. And it's funny because I remember reading that paper, and then I remember meeting Bill Peebles, and with the team, and we talked to him about it. And there was another paper, maybe another transformer paper that's similar, adjacent to DIT, that came out. We met that person as well. And I asked this question. I said, "Hey, why are transformers? What do we get out of transformers that will make a better image model? Like, what gets better? Why would things be any better?" And the answer from both of the researchers was, "I don't know." At that time, and I only remark on this because I remember writing it down and being kind of confused and being like, okay, I guess we'll stick with the unit diffusion model. And at that time, I feel like we weren't as sophisticated or smart. I wasn't as sophisticated or smart. And I don't think our research team was either at that time, because things were very new, and we kind of moved on. And it's so funny because now we have things like Sora, and now we've got SD3, which has got like this MMDIT thing, and we've got more things that are coming out, right, that are using transformers, and it's fascinating to see. And since then there have been a lot of other very cool things. I think there's an amazing paper by Meta that's doing great work in the field. Emu Edit is a really great paper. I love that paper. One of my favorites. Really inspiring because they're also using, I believe, a transformer, but they're trying to make like a multitask graphics model that they could even train like a custom embedding on for like a brand new task that it can learn with few samples, because it's already pre-trained with lots of other stuff. That's a super amazing paper. There's another one that I love, which is Video Poet by the team at Google, and they're using like a large language model backbone, and they're like doing things with video, and they pre-train on like 25% of the data is on images, and then I think like the rest is like video. It's actually mixing the modalities, which I think is super cool, very interesting. The folks at OpenAI have like kind of figured out that like multimodal probably matters a lot. I talked to some people over there. So there's kind of a big contingent of people where like things are moving towards transformers, things are moving towards multimodality. People are scaling things up. So those are maybe be like the hints that I would drop to your audience. But I would just say, like, without saying too much, maybe I've already said too much, but I think that like that's a little bit of where I think things are headed. I think that we can probably even move on from DIT, actually, even though that's like kind of the hype right now. I think we're like looking a little past that, even further past that, and saying what could be better than that.
Without asking you to spill more than you want to, I guess, and like in what ways do you think you're looking past DIT right now?
What ways? Well, I think that it's a bit a shame. I'll without saying too much, I would say it's a bit of shame that all these models are, for the graphics anyway, is just like this 77 token prompt, or a little bit, or maybe you train like a longer clip model, longer context clip model, and you know, and then it's just a prompt, and then an image comes out of that, and that's it. It's very, very low utility. You can only do so much, and then like the state of the art of that is like, okay, let me add quotes for things that I want to be text related, and then what does the model do? The model produces an image, possibly with coherent text that says like "Hello World" and someone on holding a white sign, and that's crazy. You may as well just like give the user a text box input and just let them write it anyway. But okay, sometimes it integrates it in an artful way, and but it's funny because the models will produce text just for the stuff that's in quotes, and then it's still Egyptian looking gibberish checks around the sides. Like if you had a graffiti wall and it had text, but then the graffiti surrounding that will all be like gibberish and incoherent. And it's like this is like very low progress in my opinion. I think some people are impressed. I find myself kind of like, oh, come on, we can do better than this.
Yeah, it's the fact that you can do okay with these things, but it's not easy. It's not intuitive, I guess, from the user experience perspective of I just want to prompt a model simply and say, put this text in the image, and then it won't just do that very well, I guess, or kind of as you're saying, introduce a lot of gibberish.
I guess what I would say is just that these models are too basic. They are just text to image. That's just like insufficient. Why can't the modality be far greater than that? Why can't we be doing much more sophisticated things than just like a string of 77 tokens that Clip understands? And Clip is not very good either. Clip is trained on line captions and image pairs. So it has learned a lot of semantics, but it's not extremely good at like understanding the text input, right? So it's just I find that these graphics models they're still kind of stuck in this kind of GP2 level of utility and knowledge and capability. Yeah.
I was thinking about that a lot when I feel like I've probably mentioned this example multiple times to people by now, but there was this interesting difference when I want to say DALL-E 2 and then Imagen came out, where OpenAI had, done this sort of clip like training with DALL-E 2, where, they had of course, you've like trained contrastively your vision encoder and your text encoder. And so when you are generating images in DALL-E 2, there's maybe this intuition that when you kind of feed in text embeddings, they quote unquote know something about the images because they've been trained contrastively in this sense. And then Google with Imagen is like, okay, let's just throw this giant T5 text encoder at the problem. And at least, based off of FID score and like the benchmarks at the time, it was performing better. And of course, accepting that these models still have like a lot of limitations or maybe simpler than we want them to be a bit, it was still interesting to me at the time that it was a bit counter to my intuition, I guess, that Imagen was performing better than DALL-E 2, despite the fact that you might think the clip training procedure, introduces something interesting there. And I guess now we've kind of seen a lot more models since then, but that was something that was sort of counterintuitive to me at the time.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, it, I think it's somewhat interesting. I mean, T5 like has language understanding, so I mean, it also depends on what axis something is better, right? Like there's prompt alignment and then there's image quality, and those are two very different things. I feel like to eval a model. So that's why I think there's like this maybe why like FID is a bit hard to judge. Like FID in double digits have some meaning, but as it starts to get to single digits, it starts to saturate in terms of what it even means. But I would say that yeah, I mean T5 has language understanding, and Clip I mean, it's trained on random, alt text of images on the web, right? So it has limited capability of like really aligning to these images. Obviously, it does, and like its zero shot ability at classification like continues to rise, and so it's it has a reasonable understanding. But that's like image classification. We're not talking about like these really long, sophisticated prompts, and you can see this. You can see it fail, right? You can try any open source image model at this point. Most of them are trained on line captions, and you can totally see the models can't understand basic things like prepositions, on, under, left, right? Like a puzzle prompt, for example, is like a red sphere on top of a blue sapphire cube with a orange orb to the left and a emerald triangle to the right. Models completely fail, and they even continue to fail, and they get better even if you train it on T5 XXL. They certainly get better when you use that embedding, but they still kind of fail. They still have issues, but they're vastly better.
Yeah, there have been some really interesting studies to the point that you're saying. I think this was one specifically on Clip, but it was looking at sort of the compositional understanding that it had and the fact that the model doesn't really understand the difference between a man sitting on top of a horse and a horse sitting on top of a man. And that's like a pretty simple difference. But when you're like, in this training procedure on like full captions and stuff, you can kind of see how that's not gonna quite get the point.
Yeah, we are very excited to be able to solve very consistently a horse riding on an astronaut. I think I had a tweet that did that. I think like people were like, all these people trials, like this is the hardest image prompt in graphics, and like tons of everyone done to every imaginable model and tried to do it, and like literally everybody failed.
That's
Yeah,
that's really funny.
but it shows you how low utility, like how unpowerful the things are, that it can't even do that. Yeah.
I can kind of see why, but I do want to ask a little bit more about your focus when it comes to we're at this time where, of course, you mentioned Sora, and we're seeing a lot of different models for different modalities related to vision coming out as well. So there's text to 3D, there's text to video, and I want to ask a little bit about how you're thinking about your focus here, because you're very specifically focused on just images right now and graphics, and so I kind of want to understand why you've chosen to sort of focus in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think my broad view about video is that there's a business aspect and then there's like a research aspect. I think the business aspect is that video has, largely where the value tends to be in video is in the content, not in the tools. And an example of this is like Steve Jobs, famously bought, the Pixar team. He wrote a $5 million check to George Lucas. They made a computer that made graphics, and the computer didn't go anywhere. Right? Like this computer still like sits in the Pixar data center, like, and as like a symbol. But what made that company a lot of money was making a Toy Story in the end. And so the value chain tends to go where the content is, or you have a platform like YouTube and you're distributing the content. But the tools tend to not make as much money. Now, maybe that changes if you give people more you give more people the ability to make things, then maybe the market, certainly the market will grow. Like if Adobe Premiere Pro and Final Cut Pro make $1 billion a year, and you give people more, certainly you can grow the pie. So I think that's definitely true. That would be the devil's advocate. I think with images, a lot of the value centers around the tool, Adobe Photoshop, that kind of thing. So the images themselves are largely commodities. They don't really pay for images, but the tools make up a big difference, and also the platforms matter, like Instagram, that kind of thing. So starting with image, and then the second thing is just that images are really, they are reasonable to do with compute. There's there's a rumor I think I saw on Twitter, where like the 1 minute Sora video takes 10 minutes to generate. I mean, it's completely infeasible that you like have one GPU for one user that for 10 minutes is just running to get 1 minute video that might have problems and artifacts and hands. And I think the Sora video, I think the work is amazing, by the way, but we are a team that has to nitpick things, right? So when we look at these things, we look very carefully the way we look at images. And in the video where the woman's walking down the street in Shinjuku district or something is what I'm imagining. Her legs actually flip, like her feet flip. And some people don't notice that, but I think people, keen observers that are working on this stuff do. And then so a user has to re-roll if they don't want that, right? They have to re-roll. So that's like another, whatever, maybe it's 3 minutes for that segment or 10 minutes for an entire video. This is completely infeasible in terms of cost right now. I don't think you could roll that. I think it'll be tough. I'll be surprised if they're able to roll that model out worldwide, just given the sheer compute cost of that. Whereas I think images are a good stepping stone. These image models are trained on, these video models are trained on images anyway. So I think you could think of what we're doing at Playground as sort of skating to where things are going, trying to get really good at one modality that matters a lot, that will help us get to things like video, 3D, and whatnot in the future.
Another aspect of this too that I'm kind of curious about is kind of coming to your strategy with moving forward on innovating on architectures, but then also releasing them. You open source the weights for your playground models, and of course there is kind of this big debate that goes on within the AI community about open source versus closed source. And there are like so many kind of intersecting questions and thoughts that this debate kind of overlaps with. But I'm curious, I guess, maybe to hear a little bit about your decision to go that open source route and how you kind of come down on some of these questions around it.
Yeah, I mean, these companies are, yeah, ultimately we're busy. You have to make a business, and the business has to make money. This is a very practical thing, and you can't open source. You can't open source all of your IP forever without some kind of business thing. And so people are going to try lots of different business models. Like maybe you open source your model, but you say it's a non-commercial license up to a certain amount. Like FFmpeg did this, right? They said if you make more than $10 million, you have to start paying us royalties. Simple, right? So that's a model that maybe works. There's another model, Unreal Engine, right? There's Red Hat, there's Linux, and then there's things like Mac OS and Microsoft Windows. So people are going to try a lot of different business models. I try to keep things kind of simple. We wanted to give back to the community because a lot of our product, our website, our users come from things that are open source. So we wanted to give back. We also didn't view. We also weren't very scared to release this model open source because I kind of told the team, I was like, look, if this is the best model we make, our whole company is screwed anyway. Like this should be one of the worst things we look back on. We're like, this is the worst thing we've ever done, right? The utility should be 100 or 1,000x from here. This thing doesn't matter in the long run, and it's a good way to give back. So we even gave out like pre-trained checkpoints for researchers in academia who don't have the compute to train some of these models. So we felt like that was like a good thing, obviously a good way to get our company brand out or whatever in the research community. Obviously, users don't care, but for the most part. But yeah, I mean, over time, we will release some things that maybe aren't core, but are a way to give back, and then some things will not be open source, right? And that's, I don't think we're going to put that under that. We're going to overhang that under the like pillar of like safety and imminent AGI coming. I think we can be very straightforward about it. Like, hey, look, we want to make great products for our customers, and we deserve to be rewarded for being able to do that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can't give back to open source. So I think both ecosystems can exist, and I also think that we have a history of knowing how this works out, right? With open source software, I'm a huge benefactor of open source software. I could not have built any of the companies I've built without it. So either we release things that are open, or we like support it, donate money to these companies that are doing great things.
Do you have in mind a specific vision or like threshold of a point of utility where your models get to a certain point of effectiveness where you would be less comfortable open sourcing weights and would either keep that closed or maybe do something like what you mentioned with FFmpeg imposing royalties after a certain point?
Yeah, like I said, I don't think our decision around open source has anything to do with like safety. I don't think we have this like point of view. I think largely I like disagree with this point of view, probably. But my mind is open. Maybe my point of view could change. But so I think for the most part, we're pouring a lot of money into compute, and we're pouring a lot of our hearts and our care into like making these amazing graphics models. And so, if we make something that we think is very valuable to the world, we want to continue to be able to invest in that, and we want to hire a great team. And so in those situations, like we can certainly provide an API to people so they can use it. But I don't think we're broadly going to like continue to open source forever or anything like that. But like I said, I think there could be pieces of that puzzle that are worth open sourcing because we don't believe that they are, a core competency, or we believe that people could improve on that if they knew it. And by them improving upon whatever we release, maybe we can also be benefactors of that because it's not something that we think we can continue to invest in to make better, or at least not at the rate that the open source community can, right? So that stuff, that's very easy. But I think if like we do a very powerful graphics model, we probably will not make that open source. Maybe we'll open source something that feels like a little older, or something that doesn't matter as much to us anymore, just so that I think I care a lot about academia, because I think people in academia, like we've hired people from academia, they don't have the same kind of compute resources, but they want to do great work, and we certainly read their papers and sometimes benefit. So in those cases, I think there might be ways where we can like kind of give them something that lets them pursue their greatest work and publish while while it not necessarily, while us still being able to like build a great business with products and customers and kind of like maintain a lead in the market.
That's a really good balance. Maybe to kind of refine the question I was trying to ask a little bit more. I guess the way you describe this, there is a point where you have a very powerful model and not from the safety standpoint, but more from the you've poured all your resources into this and you do need to like recoup that to an extent so you can continue investing, continue hiring people, but then are maybe willing to say release less powerful versions of the model or offer something to academia. I guess I'm wondering if you have any specific, and this is probably hard to project into the future, but if you have specific imaginations or ideas of like what very powerful looks like to you and where this calculus changes when it comes to that open sourcing, like what the model would maybe have to do for you to evaluate things a bit differently than you do now.
You mean like if the models are sufficiently powerful that you'd be like, oh man, I don't really want to open source this because like people will like use this for something bad?
No, not even from the safety perspective, but more the like there's this kind of value calculus you have to make that you've been talking about when it comes to we have this impulse of, wanting to give back to the community, to open source things as you are doing now. But as you said, there is probably going to come a point where hopefully you're able to develop models that are powerful enough to be really useful. And maybe once you get to this point, you're probably not going to like fully open source the weights. And so I'm wondering if there's like if you have in mind a specific idea of what the capabilities of this sort of model would be and like what that model would have to look like and be able to do for you to kind of make this calculation a bit differently.
I see. Yeah. I don't even think it's necessarily like a set of capabilities, but probably just like, it wouldn't be unreasonable for us. Like if we don't believe like, if we had a model that was a generation or two behind wherever we were, right? Like our goal in this case would be like, how can we help, great researchers in academia for whom don't have compute, don't have certain things, and how we help them continue to do their great research. And the benefit for us obviously would be that they would use these things and maybe we get to work with them in the future somehow, whether temporarily or full time. And I don't even think it's necessarily a capability thing. I think it's like, where do we see things going? If we see that things are going to be like another like 5x, 10x, 100x, 1000x, which I definitely do, I don't think there's any clear ceiling to me right now, then a model that was 2 generations ago is inconsequential, right? That can help academia to some extent, right? Or it's not a generation or two ago. Maybe it's like a lower model. Maybe it's a stage of the model that's like at a lower image resolution or something like that. But still very could still take 3 million, $10 million of compute to do that, and that would be okay too. So I don't think it's even a capability thing as much as it's just like if we're not really worried that like if we can kind of continue to be rewarded for the hard work that we've done while continuing to have a bit of a lead while giving back, that's the only thing that matters to me. And I'm more willing to like share than not. So yeah, like I kind of feel like things like GPT 3.5 should just be released. It should have been released because I think in that case now it doesn't matter because people have outmatched that, but they could have open sourced the weights for GPT 3.5. I think the world would have been, I think OpenAI would have gotten tons of brand equity for that. People would have made great things. It was going to commoditize anyway. It didn't matter, right? So I think that's an example of something that I would have done differently had I worked at OpenAI. But obviously they have their own structure of things that they care about.
So we were talking about kind of not looking at things from the safety perspective, but I guess another thing that I'm kind of seeing from the way you're talking about models and releasing them and all of this is within it's interesting kind of I guess like contrasting where you are working on vision from people who are mostly working on LLMs and there's all of this discourse bringing back the term AGI into common usage. And I think that is pretty annoying to a lot of people, especially people in academia, but working in, a pretty different domain where you've kind of identified a lot of room to run. I'm curious how you think about how people have been using that term and whether you look at the whole debate a bit differently.
Yeah, I've I have been at I've been at the dinners with like folks at OpenAI where we like talk about AGI, endless dinners where we talk about these kinds of things and risks and how likely it is to come and when and that kind of thing. Look, I think it's a valid quest to try to go for. I don't know that it's like necessarily my personal most important quest. Um, I think that I tend to think of things in terms of how do I create a set of tools, or how do I create technology that like allows humans to do something that exceeds anything they can do. We already have computers that can exceed human ability. We already have that. And so the only question is like, how far can we go? How far can we continue? And so I don't feel, I don't. It's hard to create. It's hard for me to create purpose personally out of being like, I'm going to make like a new species of something. I don't know why I don't have like a purpose or a reason to do that. You know, but I am very excited to try to make something that like has really great knowledge of things, really, really amazing knowledge that humans can tap to say, I want to do this thing in the world. I wish I could do this thing for which I have no skill, and to make something incredibly powerful and capable in doing that. And if it turns out that humanity judges that as AGI, then so be it. I think that's a very hard to define thing, though. And I think I came up with this thought around AGI where I was like, people are going to think that we reached AGI. So there are going to be a huge group of people that think we reached AGI sooner than we did. And there's going to be a huge group of people that think that we'll never have reached it, right? Like they will keep coming up with new puzzle challenges that this like thing isn't good at, right? And the truth is, like, we have animals that, like, humans are not capable of everything. We don't judge ourselves as a species as well. If you can't reach really high and get your hand to the top of that tree, you're not like AGI, right? It's like this weird term. Animals are capable of doing amazing things that humans can't. I think there's almost this like strange thing where humans think that like they're the most important thing. We're like the best thing ever because we could build skyscrapers in the sky. But if you ever like go swimming or something and you see like a sea lion, it's amazing how well they can swim compared to a human. But we don't judge ourselves on that. And we're judging AGI in these crazy parameters. I don't think any of that matters. I think it's like, did we make something super powerful that can help any species, whether that's a human or a dog? Or it'd be super cool if my dog barked and I knew what they were like wanted, right? Or if a baby cried and I knew what it was. Did it poop? Did it like? Is it hungry? Right? I think generally this quest is a valid one, but not one that really resonates with me personally.
I appreciate that perspective a lot, and I think that kind of brings us full circle. So this is a really good place to end. Thank you for taking the time to speak with me.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Thank you to my guest, Suhail Doshi. If you like this, it would mean a lot to me if you take a couple of seconds to share it around. And I will see you in the next episode.